Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Today I want to show you how you can custom create your own SVGs to display data on a web page. Now we're going to do this in two different stages. First of all, I'll show you how to do this in a very basic way, just so you understand how the SVG actually works. Secondly, we'll put this in a real landing page example where not only will we get this custom animation coming in, but then as we scroll, it'll actually wait till it's in the viewport and then show that with something called the intersection observer in JavaScript. On top of that, we will make this fully accessible so that if somebody is using a screen reader, when they tab over your pie chart, here is what they will hear.
30% pie chart, image.
We will set all this up with a bunch of custom data attributes so that we can do most of this in JavaScript and you don't have to be remembering to hard code all of this in the HTML. As long as each thing has a data attribute, it should be set and ready to go. Now I'll have a link to a code pen with the basic version in the description, and then a link to a GitHub repo with the full code if you're interested in that. I hope you're excited to build this out. Let's jump right in. All right, so here we are on the first version here where we're just building out that pie chart, and I've just got Live Server opening up this HTML document. It's got a style sheet that's attached that doesn't really have too much going on. We'll get back to that in a second. For now, what we want to do is we want to write our own SVG, and you can do that just with the SVG tag. And what we want to do is make this fully responsive so that as we change the size of this, everything inside this SVG will scale along with it. So to do that, let's go ahead and set a width first of all. We'll set a width of like, I don't know, let's do 200 and a height of 200. And then the other thing we want to give this is a view box. Now this view box essentially tells the browser how to draw out this SVG. It takes four values, an X, a Y, and then a width and height. So for now, let's just say 0, 0, and then let's do 200 and 200. Now inside the SVG itself, we want to actually draw out a circle. And there is a circle tag. So I'll say circle, and it's a self-closing tag. And for now, let's just give it one property. That would be a radius. So that's R equals, and in this case, let's do half of that 200. So we'll do 100 like that. Now, as soon as I save here, you're going to see that this is showing up on the right, but it's a little different than you might imagine. You know, we want a circle. Why do we have a pie chart? Well, it's actually the way that we've set up our view box. And just to make it a little easier to see, let's come up here and I'm just going to add a style tag. And you can see now that that is our view box, that 200 by 200 square. But notice that we told it to start drawing in the top left right-hand corner, which means this is basically the center where everything is going to be. Now, there are a couple ways you can switch this around. On each of the children, you can actually offset it. So for the circle here, I could grab the center of the circle, which the way you do this with a circle tag is with the CY. So Y would be the up and down position. So the center here, I'm telling it, and I can say something like 100, and that actually moves it down 100, or half the height of that view box. That means I would also need to come here and say CX, and we're going to do the same thing, 100 like that. And now it moves it exactly over to the center. Now that works for this one single circle tag, but if I have extra things, like in a moment we're going to add a text tag itself, then that actually will have to have the same kind of properties applied. I'll have to tell it exactly where to be within the view box itself. So why don't we do this? Let's just go ahead and change where it draws everything according to the view box, and then all the children we can just kind of leave alone at their default values because it will start wherever this value, this X and Y value are. So here, maybe as odd as this sounds, it's actually negative 100 and negative 100. That moves it down and to the right. And now actually, let's make this just a touch smaller. So we'll say 95, so a little bit less than half. And that ensures we don't get any of the circle cut off at all. All right, so that's what we've done so far. Now let's go ahead and just kind of move this down so it's a little bit easier to see. And I'm going to do the same thing up top, and I'll be right back with you. All right, so let's come back down to the circle itself, and let's do a few things. First of all, I'm going to set the fill here to transparent. And the reason I'm doing that is I don't actually want it to have any internal fill. Instead, I want it to have an outline. Now, unlike like div or something like that, you're not going to add a border. Since it's an SVG circle, you're going to add a stroke. So let's set a stroke width, and I'm going to set this to, let's set something like, I don't know, 40. And in order to see this, I need to give the stroke a value. So in this case, let's just say black, so it's real easy to see, and there it is. Now, the stroke is a little bit too big because you can see it starts wherever that radius is. So let's shrink this down, or maybe what we could do is shrink the radius just slightly, something like that. Now, the nice thing here is if I were to come up here and change this to like, I don't know, let's do 600 and 600 here, everything scales appropriately. So because SVGs are vector-based, they can scale infinitely just by changing the width and the height. You could do this either here or like in CSS. And because we've set up that view box correctly as far as the ratios and where it starts drawing, you can see that everything just scales exactly as you'd expect. So let's put these back down a little bit smaller, back down to our 200. Maybe let's bump it up just a touch. Let's go 300 for both of those and maybe 400. That way it's a little bit bigger for us. Now remember, what we're working on is some kind of dashboard where we can pull around and say, hey, maybe 25% of this pie chart is filled. Well, by default, the browser is going to figure out how long that path takes to get around that circle. But we can actually tell it, hey, break it up into this many chunks. And since we're going to be doing a percentage, so out of 100, why don't we just tell the path length itself to be 100? So if I come over here and say path length, and I set this to 100, now it's actually broken that up into 100 different chunks. And I can show you how that works here. And we can do that with another property that lives on the circle itself. It's called a stroke dash array. I'm going to give it two different values, and this is going to basically tell it how to draw the stroke itself. So you'll start with a solid value, and then it'll skip whatever the next value is, and it'll just keep repeating like that until it gets around the circle. So for instance, if I say 1 and 1, by default, the circle actually starts drawing it right over here, and it gives it 1, and then 1, 1, and then 1, so it's skipping every other one. So if I were to change this to something like 2, now the spaces should be bigger, and that's what's happening. Now notice, it's not dividing it evenly, it's just starting here and counting, and so here, this is where it starts by default, this right side. Here you can see that these are a little closer than they otherwise would be. Now this also means if I come over here and said, like, I don't know, 40 and 60, 40 is going to be how long it is, and then 60, which gives me that full 100 path length, will be the remainder. So this is 40% of the circle exactly right here, and this space is 60% of the circle. So we're going to use this dash offset to basically set this up the way we want to. Now, if we were just statically generating these, then this would be sufficient. However, what we're wanting to do is actually dynamically move it from nothing all the way over to 40% or whatever the pie chart should be showing. So for now, let me go ahead and move this to 50, so it'll be half of the circle exactly. And then let's add one more property called the stroke dash offset. Now what this is telling us, hey, basically how much should you offset the drawing of this circle? So by default, it's set to 0, but I can set this to whatever. So let's set this to something like 10. Now what this has done is it's moved it back a tenth of that full path length, which is 100. Now if I've lost you, don't worry, I'll explain this more as we get going, but let's go ahead and just set this dash array to 100. Just like this, it'd be 100 is how long it's going to draw the first line, and then 100 break. And since the path length is 100, basically it's going to have a complete full circle, and the next revolution, which we can do with this dash offset, will be 100 of blank, etc., etc. So what we've done here now is we've said, hey, let's offset this just by 10. And so now 10% of this circle is actually kind of hidden because we've offset it backwards. That means if I change this to 100 here, it's going to basically get rid of the entire thing altogether. And if I change it to 0, then the first draw is going to be this 100, which is that dark amount. Now the nice thing is I can actually animate this dash offset. And we'll eventually add this to our CSS, but for now what I'm going to do is just add a style tag directly in here because it's an SVG and I can basically attach this style tag along with it. Let's also get rid of this background color right here. So let's first of all grab the circle itself and let's go ahead and just get it to where it starts at the very top. And probably the easiest way to do that is with a transform, and then we'll rotate this negative 90 degrees. All right, next let's go ahead and run an animation. So we're going to say animation here. We'll give this something like draw or something like that. And let's do it over 300 milliseconds. We'll do ease in, and then let's do forward. So it just goes once and then it stops. That means I need to come down here and add some keyframes. And down below here, we're going to call this draw since that's what we said the animation would be. And we're going to go from the 100 dash offset to, and so I just need to put the 2 here, the stroke dash offset, and here let's do something like 40. Now this might be a little confusing, but basically what it's done is we're offsetting it by whatever percentage we want to be hidden. So by setting this to 40, then basically 60% is what's showing. So let's make this a little bit slower, and let's also change a couple other things. Let's move this to maybe more like 75 so that we can make the stroke width maybe more like 25, a little bit bigger. Can we get away with 30? We can get away with 30. Okay, so there it is. And you can see that every time I refresh the screen, it's actually reanimating that. And that's all you're going to do is create these circles, set a path length, and then offset it by whatever percentage you want. Now we added one more thing, and that was our text tag. In SVGs, you don't add paragraphs or anything like that. You just add a text. So for instance, this would say something like 60%. Now you can see it shows up right there in the center. Let's go ahead and do a couple things though to improve the styling. So I'm just going to grab the text tag itself, and let's say font size will be 3 rem and font weight will be bold. And I've got a font being pulled in already from my style sheet. And then let's set the line height here to 1 just to make sure we don't have any funky spacing things. And for now, I'm going to change 2 other elements, and these are, again, unique to the text tag in an SVG. First one is called text anchor, and this I'm going to set to middle. As you can see there, that moves it left and right to the middle. And then I also want to set a dominant baseline. And I'm going to set this to the middle as well, and this sets the up and down. And of course, you cannot spell it dominate. You have to spell it dominant, like that, dominant baseline, and that moves it right to the middle. Now, that might be a little bit too big for my liking, so let's set it to something more like 2.5, something like that. Now, what we're doing is setting a base font size here. But as you can see, if I were to come up here and change this, so let's change this again to something like 600, it's actually going to scale with the SVG. And that's, again, the whole point of scalable vector graphics is they'll scale together. So I'm setting it for whatever size I'm seeing, but then it's scaling it appropriately based on the width and the height. Now let's add one more little piece of styling, and that is, let's go ahead and set this to an opacity of 0. And so I'm going to hide the text to start with, and then we will have an animation. And here I'm going to say like a rise or something like that. And we'll do 900 milliseconds, ease in and forwards. And then I am going to put a delay on this. So let's do something like 200 milliseconds for the delay. And now let's go ahead and write this. And all I want it to do is to rise up. So keyframes, and I'll say rise. And then we'll go to, once again here, this time it'll just be opacity. Let's see, opacity will be 1 at that point. And then the other thing I want is let's transform. I'm going to translate it y in the y direction back to 0. Now that also means I need to move this up here, and let's do something like -20. So let's come over here if we did all that correctly, and I did not put a semicolon here. Sorry about that. Now it should actually rise. Let's see. I don't want it negative. I want it positive. There we go. So it comes up from below. All right, so that's the basics of creating this kind of cool animation that will load on screen. Now, the only trouble is if you have a bunch of text up top here, when you first load your screen, it's actually going to do this out of sight of the user. So what we need to do next is put this in a real page environment and actually see how you might delay this so that it only shows once a user puts it in the screen. And we're going to do that with JavaScript and something called the intersection observer. All right, so here we are in a real landing page example, and you can see here I've got 1, 2, and then 3 circles. Now I've actually got a stroke dash offset here. Let me go ahead and put that back on, and that makes them all disappear. And I've done a couple other things, so let me walk you through them. I've given these things some data attributes, and that's because we're going to access this kind of stuff in JavaScript. The other thing I've done here is given this like a data color, and I've given it a color according to the CSS variables I set up. So like this first one is, I guess this might be the last one here, or this middle one here is the text itself. And anything with this data color text, I've gone ahead over here and just added it to where it should have a stroke and a color, so I can use that for both the text like here and here, and then also the circle itself. So other than that, a lot of this is pretty normal. This is the stuff we already did, except instead of just having a text, I actually have it inside this DataPy attribute, and anything with the DataPy attribute, basically you can think of as that SVG. A lot of the other stuff here should look similar, like for instance, there's our circle transform. Actually, why don't we put this inside of a DataPy anyhow while we're at it. So there it is. It's going to be here, here, and here. So I've basically set colors that way. So that's why I've set the DataPy here and then use the color this way. The other thing I'm doing is setting the percentage I want it to be here in this data-%. And for all of these, again, I'm using data attributes, which are essentially a way of declaring your own custom attributes while having the safety of knowing that you're never going to get this overridden with some spec. So anytime you add data dash to something, that's a surefire way of basically making sure that you're not going to get this Sherlocked in the future by the spec. I've also added a couple other things here. You can see I've added data delay. That's because some of these I'm going to basically change how fast or slow they go when they appear based off this attribute. And then I've also set this data speed, which again would be the speed of how fast it goes. Now notice this is like a number here. This is a string. And I'm just showing you different ways that you might accidentally do that. And that way we can account for this in the JavaScript. Now the other thing I've done here is I've added this text down below, but I've added an ARIA hidden, and that's because once we set this up with screen readers, I actually want people to be able to navigate to the SVGs and to read out text there, and by default, this text gets read out if you don't have an ARIA hidden attribute on it. Lastly, before we jump in, I've also removed all of our animations, and that's because I want to add them in JavaScript. Now you can, of course, leave this in the CSS, but I actually want to show you how to animate things using JavaScript to kind of tell CSS what to do. So that's what we're going to do using a lot of the same things we already just set up. All right, well, enough chatting. Let's come over here to our index file, which I've linked up top in this HTML document. And again, you can start right here with me if you jump into the GitHub. First of all, I'm going to grab all the pie charts, and we'll say document.querySelector, and we're grabbing all of them. And I want anything with this data pie attribute. Next, let's go ahead and set up a little loop here. So we'll grab all of our pie charts and say for each pie chart, so we'll just call this each chart, and then let's do an arrow function in here. We want to get a bunch of things about the chart itself. So let's go ahead and grab the delay first of all, and this can just be chart.dataset.delay. And if for some reason I don't get something passed in, so for instance, if I forget to set that, I want to just set this to 0 so there will be no delay by default. And then let's copy this down a few times. And this next one I want to set not as the delay, but I want to grab the percent. So that's the percentage it should go around. And then next I want to grab the circle itself. Actually, I don't quite need this many because what we're going to do here is look inside the chart itself, and we're going to do a query selector there. And inside here, what we're going to do is grab the circle tag. Let's come down one more time, and this time I'm going to grab the text tag. Now, with that text tag, let's say the text content should be equal to, and what I want here is in backticks, so I can interpolate this. I want percent, so whatever the percentage is on that data set, like that. Now let's go ahead and work on animating both the text and the circle so we can actually see what we've done here, and then we'll work on a few important things for accessibility. So let's animate the circle first of all, and if you do circle.animate, there's actually ways that you can animate just using JavaScript. In fact, let's come over here and search for element animate, and then we'll grab the MDM docs right here, and you can see that this basically allows you to add animations. So you pass it the keyframes, and then you can also pass it some options. So let's first of all look at these keyframes. You can see that these are either an array of keyframe objects or a keyframe object whose properties are arrays. And basically, you're iterating over those different keyframes. So like from a value to a certain value. And those are the keyframes you'd pass in either as an array or as an object whose properties are arrays. And then you can also pass in a bunch of different options. In fact, if I click here, it's going to give us what those are. So we've got delay, we've got direction, like forwards, reverse, whatever, duration, easing. This looks very familiar if you're comfortable with keyframes in CSS because that's basically what it is. So let's pass in two items then. First of all, we're going to pass in an array. That will be our keyframes. And then secondly, we're going to pass in some options, and that will be an options object. All right, so what are the values we want to go to? This array itself is going to have different objects, and that will basically tell it to go from something to something else. So there are other ways to do this, but probably the cleanest, I think, to understand it is just to set stroke dash offset. We're going to start this at 100. Now notice I'm not using the CSS name, I'm using the JavaScript name for stroke dash offset because obviously I'm writing JavaScript here. So then copy all of this down and say that it's going from this value to this value. And what's the value we want to go to? Well, it's going to be from 100, and then we're going to take our percentage off of that. Remember what we've done with the percent is we're saying, hey, here's the value I want it to be. And the way that that dash offset works, remember whatever value you're passing in here is basically the opposite value that you want to show. So I want to show the opposite, whatever's left over after 100 minus whatever percentage I passed in. I hope that makes sense. We'll see it here in practice in just a second, and that should help. The duration, so this is one of these options right here, this duration. I want this to be my speed value. Now, I actually don't know, did I grab my speed value? I did not. All right, so we had one more to grab, and that is our speed, like that. And here I want this to be speed. And then for the easing, let's go ahead. You could set this as another data attribute, but I'm just going to paste in something on my clipboard here. This is a cubic Bezier curve, so it'll be a little bit more, I don't know, natural looking. And then finally, I want to pass in a fill value. Now, I think I said direction earlier was fill. That's not true. All right, that is down here, right here. So backwards, forwards, and what I want is forward. So it happens once, and then it doesn't happen anymore. Now, if I save this and we jump back over this way, and I refresh, nothing happens. All right, let's see. Let me make sure I actually hooked up the JavaScript. I didn't. All right, I probably took it out so I could show you how to do it, just to make sure you didn't do that, what I just did. So let's fix it together. So I'm going to say script src, and this is just index.js. And then we do need to go ahead and defer it after the body so that it loads after all the DOM content has loaded. Now I should be able to come over here and something should happen. Aha, we have an error. And you can see here we've got a problem with our duration. So let's come back over this way. And I've set my duration to my speed value. Let's just change this to something like 100. Okay, so there you go. But that should be pulling in something from here. So let's come back over this way and data speed. Now here I've got just this 800 and it's a number here, and I do want it to be a number, but you can see it's just a string in HTML. So what I want to do is come over here on both this and this, and this. And what we're going to do is just add a plus symbol to the front. Basically, what that will do is coerce it into a number itself. So however you've written it in your HTML, it should actually use it as a number, which means you can do math on it properly like this. Now you can see when I come over this way, now all of them are loading automatically. In fact, when I come down here, these are already done. If I get them all on screen and refresh, you can see they all move to the proper amount. And because I've set a different delay or speed on all of these, you can see that they actually move slower or faster depending on how I've set up their data attributes. Our text, however, is still not showing. So what we need to do is actually copy this down and animate our text just like we did in the CSS earlier. So both here and here, I'm going to go ahead and remove both of these and say opacity 0. And then we'll say transform. And then in quotation marks here, I'm going to say translate y 20%, like that. We haven't gone to anything yet, so I'll need to change this to 1 and change this to 0. And now what we're doing is doing the same thing we set up in our CSS, except now we're just doing it through JavaScript. That means if I save this, they should pop up just like that. And you can notice that the speed I set is actually affecting these as well. Now I did pass in a delay attribute up top from that data attribute. I actually want to use that for my text here. So I'm going to set this to my delay. And that will basically allow the text to come up when it needs to at the proper time. The speed, however, I actually want to manually set here because it doesn't matter how slow the circle animates. I want that delay to change. However, the speed, I always want it to come up about the same speed, which will be about 300 milliseconds. So you can see now when it gets right towards the end, that delay decides when it comes up, but it all comes up at the same time. All right, so that's the animation. Now let's do a couple of things just to improve the accessibility. First of all, where I add the actual text itself, so the percentage, whatever percent, 30%, whatever, I also want to add one more thing, which is on the actual chart itself, so the thing that I'm looping over, I want to set an attribute. So set attribute, and the thing I want to set is an ARIA label. And in backticks here, so I can add the percentage, I'm going to say percent, so that's like 30 or 60 or 90 or whatever, percent pie graph. Well, I guess we've been calling this a chart, so pie chart. Now you might remember we hid this text itself from screen readers and other assistive technology. And the reason we did that is because we were setting our own ARIA label for the entire image. So now if somebody actually tabs to this image using assistive technology, it's going to read out 30% pie chart. And then the next thing it'll read out is this text over here. It's going to skip over this little text thing. Otherwise, we'd say 30% pie chart, 30%. And then it would read the heading, which also has 30% in it. All right, so what we're doing is basically just deciding how they can interact with this so that they don't have to keep tabbing through 30% everywhere they go and can quickly get the info from the actual chart itself. The other thing I want to do, if I come over here and open up my DevTools and hit Command-Shift-P, and I'm going to open the Rendering tab, and that panel is right down here. Let's scroll down, and what I want to do is, let's see, prefers reduced motion right here. So normally, if I refresh this, when they have prefers reduced motion on, obviously not in the DevTools, but on their system, I don't want this to be animating like that. Now in CSS, you can do a media query to figure this out, but in JavaScript, you actually have to access a property on the window. So let's go ahead and set a variable here to prefers reduced motion. What we're going to ask is if the window.matchMedia equals, and then in parentheses here, we're going to have prefers reduced motion set to reduce. So now what this should give us is whether or not they have their system set to prefers reduced motion. And just to make sure, let's go ahead and console.log this. And now if I come over here, let's pull this down here. I'm not sure what's going on. Let me refresh. Oh, okay. I don't know what that was. But basically, you're going to see here we get a media query matching list. And what we're looking at is this property. And here it says true. Now, if I change this back to no emulation and go again, you can see now it says false. So we're going to use this when they first come to our site to determine whether or not to show these animations. Because the way we've set all of this up, we can just update this speed variable itself based on whether or not they've got that set. So let's actually move this up top. In order to change this, we're going to need to make this a let variable. And I can just say prefers reduced motion here. And if that is true, let's use a logical and. We're going to say speed should now be equal to 0. So even if I have a data set, if they have prefers reduced motion on, I don't want any speed at all. Now if I save this here, it should just automatically show up, and then that text slides up. Now if you want to minimize that as well, you could also do the same thing down this way. Here I could say prefers reduced motion. If that is true, then I'm going to set this to 0. Otherwise, I'm going to set it to 300. And then you can see it just pops right in there. Now, if you want to kill that delay, again, you could do the exact same thing here. Bring this up this way. and get rid of the delay if they don't have prefers reduced motion, because of course you wouldn't need that. And I prefers reduced motion again and refresh. And let's see. Okay, well, I think what we did is we're still just getting the entire object. We just want whether or not it matches. So let's come back up top here and just change this to dot matches. So we're just going to look at that one property. Okay, there we go. So now it actually pulls in. That means if I come back here and turn that off and refresh, now yeah, so it just pops in immediately. So by doing that, we've got this little check so that people's preferences are taken into account. Now, no motion doesn't necessarily, or reduced motion doesn't necessarily mean no motion, but in this case, I'm not exactly sure how you would do just a little motion here and still get the same effect of it moving around the circle. So I think probably it's safer just to have nothing. All right, let's go ahead and remove this. And now we need to do one more thing, which is we actually want to delay when these things load based on whether or not they're in the viewport. So if I refresh here and then scroll down, all of these are already going to be here. And like we saw with our finished example at the beginning, we actually want these to wait until they get in the viewport. Well, we can do that with something called an intersection observer. I've done videos like this before, and if you're interested in that, I'll try to remember to add them at the end of the video. But let's just kind of do a quick example here. What we're going to do here is let's have this be pie chart observer. And this isn't really a pie chart. It's more of like a line circle chart. I'm not sure what that would be called, but that's good enough for me. And then we're going to say new intersection observer. And as you can see here, VS Code is telling me I can pass it a callback, which I need to do. So that's a function that'll actually run whenever this intersection observer is fired. And then secondly, I can pass it some options. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to pass each of these charts in as a separate thing that it's going to be watching for. So that's what we're going to do. Let's go ahead and come back down this way then. And here I'm going to do another for each loop, but we're going to get rid of the one below here in just a second. We'll do dot for each. And then what we're looking at is each chart. I'm going to add it in parentheses, even though you don't have to, since it's just one placeholder that we're passing in. But what I'm going to do is pass it to my pie chart observer, and then I'll say dot observe. And then what I want to observe is my chart. So what I'm doing here is I'm using this method that lives on the observer, on any observer you create, and I'm passing in the individual item, that individual chart. Now what we're going to have here is we're going to have a callback function. Let's just put that here as a placeholder, and then you can pass in an options object. And one of the items here you can pass in is something called a threshold. And this threshold option will say how much of the item needs to be in the viewport before you consider this intersection observer fired for that individual item. And in this case, what I want is I want most of that pie chart to be visible before it actually triggers the animation. So let's do something like 0.8. So it's out of 1, so 0.8 means 80% of it needs to be in the viewport for this to fire. All right, so that's our options. Let's now come into our callback here. And what I'm going to have is for each of those things, they're going to have an entry. All right, so they're the entry itself. And you can name this whatever you want, but the thing that's been passed in, basically. So we could call this charts if we want, or whatever we want. But basically what we're saying is whatever gets passed in. In this case, I know it's my pie charts. So what I'm going to do is say entries dot for each. And then what we're going to do is for now, let's just go ahead and grab let's call it a chart, just to keep the naming kind of similar. Then I'm just going to console.log the chart dot is intersecting, which is going to be one of the methods we get back. Actually, let's just do the chart so I can show you everything. So now if I come over this way, when I first load the page, every one of those will fire automatically. Then whenever they enter the viewport, like this one has here, I'll get another one. But you can see here I get this entire entry here. So for like this one right down here, you can see I've got where it's at on the page, intersecting ratio, that's how much of it is on the screen, like that threshold over here. Then I get, all importantly, this is intersecting. So this must be the bottom one. It's not intersecting, not intersecting, not intersecting. Now, as I move, I should actually get more of them firing. Here now, this one switches to true because 80% of it is on the screen, which is the threshold that we set. So let's come back over here. And with this is intersecting true, now I know it's on the screen according to the threshold option that I set. So the only thing I actually am interested in is if this is intersecting. So let's refresh here, and you're going to see that this one is because it's at least 80% on the screen and these two are not. As I start to scroll though, now that one is, and now that one is. All right, and now these are getting off the screen, so now they're false. So you get it automatically every time they come in and out of the viewport. This intersection observer is fired. Well, now that we've got that, let's go ahead and close this down. What we're going to do is use this is intersecting to determine whether or not we should animate this on. So let's come up here and write a little if statement. So what we're going to say is if the chart dot is intersecting. So if that is the case, then we actually want to write all the stuff we have below. So what I can do is come inside this whole for each loop and copy out all of this stuff because we're just going to attach it to that individual instance. So let's copy that, kill this for each loop. We don't need that anymore. And now I can come inside here and just paste all that back in. Now it's not going to work automatically, and that's because we've named all this according to that for each loop. Let me first of all clean up where this is at, and then I'll be right back with you just so that everything is ordered a little bit more precisely. All right, so I formatted that all correctly. Now what we need to do is just work on this right here, because what we've got is this individual item being passed in, the chart, and we're asking if it is intersecting. If I were to come back up here, and let's console.log that chart again, just so we can see the entire object that we get from the intersection observer. If I come in here, here we go. You're going to see that what we have inside of this, if it will stop erroring out on me, is we've got the target itself. That's the SVG, the actual element we're interested in. So all we need to do is come inside here. Let's grab that one and hit Command D, Command D, Command D, Command D, Command D. And then inside of all these, we're going to say chart.target, and then everything should work as we expect. So that's all we have to update. Basically, we're looking inside the intersection observer element that's been passed in. We're looking at the target object, and then we're going ahead and looking at the data set, the data attributes that we have set. Now, there's actually one more thing we need to do, because if I come up here, let's just shorten this by saying is intersecting so we don't have to get the entire object. But if I go ahead and load the page to start with, you're going to see that they all come on, and then they should stop animating. So as I move this in, now it comes on. I move this in, now it comes on, but the animations don't need to happen anymore. However, we're still actually observing those intersections. So if I scroll, you're going to see that it just keeps going on and on. So it keeps trying to animate that over and over again. So what we want to do is we actually want to stop observing right after we're done looking at the animation. So let's come in here. So now what I want to do is after I've animated both the text and the circle, I want to grab my pie chart observer and I want to dot unobserve whatever the target is that I'm looping over at the current time. So this would be my chart.target. What this means is now after I've animated it, I will no longer be observing that, which means it won't keep animating over and over again. So if I come down here, all those should animate, but now as I move up and down, once they've all three animated, nothing else is happening because it stopped being observed. So now we've got this set up so it will work properly. When we first load the page and we come up top here, you're going to notice that only the first one animates in. Once we get 80% of the second one, then that one will animate in, and the same thing for the third one. But now, because we've set it to unobserve that, they're done animating and they won't keep watching it and using up the browser's bandwidth anyhow. All right, let's go ahead and remove this console log, and we're going to call this project done. I hope that was a big help. We worked on intersection observers. We worked on writing our own SVGs, how you might pass in data attributes to kind of customize how each one of these works. We wrote our keyframes in JavaScript this second time around, and then we made sure it was accessible so that as you're tabbing through the page with a screen reader or something like that, then you'll actually get a readout of exactly what you're looking at, which is a pie chart up to 66% or whatever the pie chart is that you're looking at. Hey, well, thanks again. I really appreciate your time, and I will catch you in the next one. Happy coding.